Hey guys, I'm back to do part 2 of my top 20 favorite artists, and almost immediately after doing my part 1, I started thinking, oh man, I forgot a few bands in there. But then the problem is, as I mentioned before, is who do you remove from what you've already included? So some of the bands I think I may have left off. That would probably be in the, because I started at 28, and these bands would probably be in the maybe 28 to 15 range, depending on my mood on the day. So the Doors, the Byrds, the Smiths, just to name a few. But then, who would I take off? I don't really know. So, I'm sure that's a problem that anybody doing a list like this would have. But anyway, I'm here today to do my top 10. And I've got quite a few albums to show. I'll say a little bit about when I started liking this particular band or artist and why I like them. And I'm going to show, in most cases, some of my favorite albums from those artists, but also some new purchases that I've got in the last month or so. And I think it's telling that with your favorite artists and your favorite bands, you start pretty much with their proper studio albums, and then you start acquiring all these little extras, whether they be live albums or special releases. I'm going to call them, and I'll talk about that as I get to each one. So anyway, starting with number 10. It's Cream, and I'm showing you the reunion album that Cream made live at the Royal Albert Hall 2005. And I'm just going to say right off the bat, I love all these bands, and Cream is no exception. I think this is Eric Clapton's best period. I also really like his Derek and the Dominos album, and also the work he did on the John Mayall Beano album. But this is a great example of a band who reunited after so many years apart, and reunited and made an amazing live album. And the performances in England were really praised, and the playing and so forth. They, after this, several months later, they did a show in New York which didn't get as high praise as this, but this album is amazing. Eric Clapton is just on fire on this, and quite different, I think, from some of his solo stuff where he had kind of mellowed out a little bit. So this is highly recommended. This is a triple LP set of the 2005 reunion. And then a recent acquisition for Cream is this nice tri-colored vinyl, which is the Cream, the BBC Sessions. I've had the BBC Sessions on CD for many years. This is sort of a shortened version of that, that basically has sessions from 66 and 67. They focus mainly on Cream's first two albums, Fresh Cream and Disraeli Gears. So you have stuff like Sweet Wine, I Feel Free, NSU, Four Until Late from Fresh Cream, and then from Disraeli Gears you have Strange Brew, Tales of Brave Ulysses, We're Going Wrong, and Outside Women Blues. And then there's also some non-album tracks, like Wrapping Paper, which was an early single of theirs. There's one song, it was sort of previewing their third album, Wheels of Fire. So their cover, Born Under a Bad Sign, is on here, which is a cover of Albert King. And what else is on here? Yeah, so it's pretty cool, and the sound quality on this is pretty good. So Cream, the BBC Sessions, Cream at number 10. Number 9, I've shown these guys in my videos many times before, King Crimson. And I was pretty late coming to the King Crimson party. I only really got into King Crimson sometime in the early 2000s, but I've gone really hard for them. And obviously I'm showing an album that everybody knows, which is In the Court of the Crimson King. The thing that I love about King Crimson is Robert Fripp obviously is sort of the main person and constant in the band, but they've gone through so many lineup changes and yet have been able to make so many great albums in many different periods of the band. So I'm going to show you a great album from each of the different periods that I consider for King Crimson. So obviously In the Court of the Crimson King, you guys all know this album, fantastic album with the early band with Fripp, Greg Lake, Michael Giles, an amazing drummer. Michael Giles, I'm forgetting some people, probably Ian McDonald as well, so fantastic first King Crimson album from '69. Then we have my favorite King Crimson album, Red, with the lineup of Fripp, Wetton, John Wetton, and Bill Bruford. They made 3 amazing studio albums with this particular lineup, and this is my favorite of all the King Crimson albums, Red. And then the band disbanded and reformed in 1981 to make Discipline. And the interesting thing about this album is when the band reformed in '81, it was Fripp and Bruford from the previous lineup, and also Adrian Belew and Tony Levin joined. And originally the band was not called King Crimson, they were called Discipline, the name of this album. And then somewhere along the lines, they decided to retake on the King Crimson name. But again, another lineup and another fantastic King Crimson album. And then just to prove to you further that I love King Crimson, a couple of recent acquisitions by a key member of King Crimson. My favorite lineup, even though my favorite album of theirs is Red, my favorite lineup is actually the Belew, Levin, Fripp, Bruford lineup. And so I have a lot of Adrian Belew stuff, and a recent acquisition is this album from the band that he formed after that 80s version of King Crimson kind of took a hiatus. This is the band The Bears, which for many years, I wasn't into this album when it came out, but and I was hesitant to get it because I didn't think it would really sound a lot like Belew or King Crimson, but it actually does quite a bit, although it does lean obviously more towards Belew solo stuff than it does the King Crimson stuff. But The Bears from 1987, fantastic album by this 4-piece. And then finally, to finish off King Crimson, an album that I've had on CD for many years, we have Adrian Belew and Young Lions from 1989, and you can see from the sticker there, featuring David Bowie. So this was around the time that Belew actually was Bowie's musical director when Bowie had the Sound and Vision tour in the late 80s. And then Bowie returned the favor by guesting on a couple of tracks on this Belew album called Young Lions. Excellent stuff. So that's King Crimson at number 9. Number 8, Catherine Wheel. This is in my top 5 albums of all time. This is Catherine Wheel's debut album. Catherine Wheel, UK band affiliated, or especially early on around this album, in the shoegaze scene in the UK, and definitely one of the bands that I've seen the most live when they were around. I think they disbanded around, I'm going to say around 2000-ish or so, but this is an amazing album, their debut, Ferment. So Catherine Wheel at number 8. Number 7, we have The Beat, or as they were known in North America, The English Beat. So this is one of the UK ska bands back from the late 70s, early 80s. This is their debut album, I Just Can't Stop It, and for many, many years this album was my number 1 album of all time. It has since dropped to number 2. We'll get to what's number 1 a little later on. Fantastic album. The Beat are my favorite of the British ska bands, and this is just what I would classify as a perfect album. They blended some punk sounds and some other world sounds in with their version of ska. So I just can't stop it. The Beat only made 3 albums, and then the main 2 guys, Dave Wakeling and Ranking Roger, disbanded or left the band. Quite a sour leaving of the band. And the thing that I find about my favorite bands is when they break up or when people go solo, you tend to follow those members and their other projects and what they've done. So as I mentioned, Dave Wakeling and Ranking Roger, who were on vocals. Dave Wakeling also played guitar, wrote a lot of the material. Ranking Roger was the toaster, the MC in the band. And Dave Wakeling left the band, left the English Beat, and asked Ranking Roger to come along with them, and they formed this band, General Public. This is General Public's debut album, All the Rage. Most of you will know probably the song Tenderness, which was a big hit. So early on, it seemed like a great move for Wakeling and Ranking Roger, who now were just splitting the profits between the 2 of them as opposed to the 6 members of the Beat. But over the course of time, this album got a little bit dated. It was sort of guilty of that 80s sound, if you will, which some people don't like. I think this is an amazing album, excellent album. I still play it today, but I'll be honest, it's not as good as the English Beat. Then the other band that was formed from the ashes of the English Beat were the Fine Young Cannibals. This is their debut album, which is a much better album, I think, than the General Public album. This band was formed by Andy Cox and David Steele on guitar and bass in the English Beat, and they hooked up with a soul singer named Roland Gift. And this is an amazing album. You guys will probably know this song, Johnny Come Home. Fantastic album. This band only made a couple of albums and then they disbanded after that. So English Beat at the Beat or English Beat at number 7. Number 6, the band that is responsible for my favorite album of all time, the Stone Roses, and their debut album. I've shown this album many times before. You guys all know this album. An amazing album. A lot of 60s influence in this band. And they recently, in the last few years, had their massive reunion tour that lasted about 4 years. Unfortunately, they weren't able to recreate the magic and make another studio album. They were only able to come up with 2 songs released as singles, and they were okay. They weren't great, and I think they realized that, and that's why they didn't go on to make an album. So Stone Roses number 6. I'm also going to show you this Stone Roses album, Turns into Stone. So there was a big gap between, the Stone Roses only made 2 official studio albums, and there was a big gap between their debut that I just shown and their second album. And this sort of came in between, which was a collection of B-sides and non-album singles, which is very much faithful to the sound of their first album. So if you really like the Stone Roses' first album, you would really like this. So songs on here that you will know, probably there's an early version of Elephant Stone that was on the first album. Fool's Gold is on this album, which was a massive hit for them. And the song One Love is also a single that was released from this album. So Stone Roses turns into Stone. And then the second album, which gets a lot of criticism, is the Stone Roses' Second Coming. Love Spreads is the well-known song on this. The major difference in this album and the first album is the guitar is much more Jimmy Page-like, I would say, on this album. John Squire, the Stone Roses guitarist, amazing guitarist, but less of that chiming 60s pop kind of feel, psychedelic feel, and more of a Jimmy Page influence on guitar. So Stone Roses at number 6. Number 5, we have Dire Straits. I love Dire Straits. I got into them big time in the 80s when they released Brothers in Arms, and then I went backwards to collect everything. And I just love Mark Knopfler and collect all his solo stuff as well. I'm showing this album for Dire Straits, which is their 1991 album, on every street, because I don't think this album gets enough love out there, and to me it's as good, if not better, than Brothers in Arms. It certainly wasn't as successful, but this is a fantastic Dire Straits album. Reissue, fantastic sounding vinyl on this one. So Dire Straits and Mark Knopfler in at number 5. Number 4, I've shown this guy many times before. Mark Knopfler, by the way, is my number 3 favorite guitarist of all time. Jeff Beck's number 2. And my favorite guitarist of all time is Jimi Hendrix. You guys all know this album, Smash Hits. I got this album after many years. I've had other greatest hits on CD for Jimi Hendrix, and I realized that there's actually a lot of songs on this album that I do not have on any other vinyl because of the different track lists on UK versus North American releases. So Jimi Hendrix, number 4, Smash Hits. Another recent Jimi Hendrix acquisition is Before the Experience. We have this compilation, The Eternal Fire of Jimi Hendrix, and this is Jimi Hendrix with Curtis Knight and I guess Lonnie Youngblood doing the majority of the vocals, but the guitar you can hear already, very Hendrix style guitar. And in another recent Hendrix acquisition, we have Crash Landing. This is from released in 1973. This is some... Normally I don't go for this kind of release, but because this is taking some initial recordings of Hendrix and then adding some other studio elements, which kind of changes the original intention. But when you're a big Hendrix fan, sometimes you feel you see this for a good price and you gotta grab it. So Hendrix at number 3. Hendrix at number 4. I apologize. Number 3. Bob Marley. I've shown Bob Marley many times. I love Bob Marley so much that my wife and I actually gave my daughter Nicole the middle name of Marley. Not spelt the same way, but still, that was as an homage to Bob Marley. So this, you guys all know this album. This is Burning. I'm showing this because this was the last album that included the original Wailers on it. Peter Tosh and Bunny Wailer. And then for many years, my favorite Bob Marley album, now I would probably say it's Exodus, which has a lot more sort of love songs type of lyrics. But for many years, my favorite Bob Marley album was this album, Survival, which came after Exodus. I think this was 78. Much more militant and a topical lyrics on this Bob Marley album. So Bob Marley at number 3. Number 2 is David Bowie, and just a bit of a backstory on David Bowie. I got into David Bowie around the time of Let's Dance in '83, and there was a concert on TV here in Canada for the Sirius Moonlight Tour that I taped, and back then they had some concerts that the sound was simulcast on the radio. So I had a VHS tape of the concert and also a cassette tape of the concert as well. And he, as you can imagine, he played on that tour a lot of his back catalog. And then I went to the mall one time with my parents when I was still fairly young, and I went to a store called Music World, which was a chain store back then in Canada, and they had this table with all these cassettes just all spread out on the table with a deal. I think it was like 3 for $9 or something like that. So they let me choose 3, and I chose these 3 albums on cassette, which were my introduction into David Bowie's back catalog. So the 3 cassettes were this, this, and this. I think 3 pretty good albums to start off with after hearing Let's Dance. I think you'd all agree those are all classics. And I've got all the Bowie albums from the 70s, and I was only missing one, which was the debut album, which I wasn't too keen on before. But I was pretty familiar with that album, just a self-titled album that he made back in the 60s, because I borrowed a cassette tape one time from the library, so I was very familiar with those songs. And then recently, I was able to get the majority of those songs on this compilation called The World of David Bowie. And as you can see, this is one thing that I kind of hate, is the songs are definitely from a period back in the 60s, I think 67, 68. And David Bowie did not look like that picture back in 67, 68. That's obviously from the Ziggy period. But I think 10 out of the 14 tracks or so from that album is on this, along with a few others that I like In the Heat in the Morning. But I've connected with this album, and many years after kind of discarding it, I've fallen in love with it again. And the best way that I can describe this, I used to describe it, I think, incorrectly as, these are sort of children's kind of songs. I don't think that's very accurate after all. And there's a guy out here in Canada who does videos that I really like. His channel name is Dallas Pez. Shows a lot of great psych albums on there, and he's used this word a few times to describe some psych albums, and I think it's totally fitting of this David Bowie album, and that's whimsical. I definitely would describe this as whimsical. So David Bowie at number 2, and you guys all know who's number 1. There's no real surprises. Number 1, we have The Police. And I'm going to show you, rather than show you the albums that you've seen millions of times before, I'm going to show you 3 albums that really only any diehard Police fan would probably own. We have the Brimstone and Treacle soundtrack, which is Sting and the Police doing songs for a movie that Sting starred in, which was his very first motion picture. So I've got this from way back in the day. This came out, I think, in between Ghost in the Machine and Synchronicity. So Brimstone and Treacle soundtrack. Then we have the drummer Stuart Copeland, the rhythmist. This came after Synchronicity, and this is Stuart Copeland going to Africa and making a soundtrack of his travels throughout Africa. The rhythmist. And finally, we have the guitarist Andy Summers and his solo album XYZ, which was released again also after Synchronicity. This is Andy Summers, who has done a lot of fusion and sort of new agey kind of stuff, but this is Andy Summers' attempt at a pop album, very much in the vein of the Police sound, and it succeeds in some cases, in most cases it doesn't. His vocals are not great. The guitar sound is still there, but Andy Summers is much better off doing the instrumental fusion thing. So Andy Summers. So Police number 1, of course. Long video. I know I spoke very quickly. Excuse me. I know I spoke very quickly. Thanks a lot for watching, and we'll see you next time.